Apache elder pointed to the stranger and said, "You took my daughter." An Apache elder walked 300 miles through desert hell to find the white man who destroyed his family. And when he finally pointed his finger and spoke those 5 words, the entire town went silent. The morning sun cut through Millerville like a rusty blade, casting shadows that stretched long and dark across the weathered wooden sidewalks. Thomas Whitmore stood outside Murphy's General Store, counting coins in his calloused palm, when the silence fell over the settlement like a heavy blanket. It wasn't the usual quiet of a lazy Tuesday morning. This silence carried weight, the kind that made horses stamp their hooves and dogs slink beneath porches. Thomas looked up from his handful of silver, squinting against the glare, and saw him. An Apache man walked down the center of Main Street, his moccasined feet raising small puffs of dust with each deliberate step. His hair, silver-streaked and braided with leather cord, caught the light like polished stone. Deep lines carved his face into a map of hard years and harder losses. He wore no war paint, carried no weapons that Thomas could see, but something about his presence made the air itself feel dangerous. The man's dark eyes swept across the gathered faces of shopkeepers and settlers who had emerged from doorways and windows. His gaze moved like winter wind across a frozen lake until it found Thomas and stopped dead. Time stretched thin as rawhide between them. The Apache elder raised his arm, pointing a gnarled finger that seemed to carry the weight of mountains and the fury of storms. When he spoke, his voice carried across the dusty street clear as church bells on Sunday morning. "You took my daughter." The words hit Thomas like a physical blow. His coins scattered from nerveless fingers, ringing against the wooden planks at his feet. Around him, the townspeople shifted and murmured, their whispers rising like smoke from dying embers. Thomas felt his mouth go dry as desert sand. He tried to form words, but his throat had closed tight as a fist. The old man's eyes never left his face, and in those dark depths, Thomas saw something that made his knees go weak: recognition. This wasn't a case of mistaken identity. This man knew him. I don't. Thomas finally managed to croak, but the words died in the dust between them. The Apache elder took another step forward. The crowd parted around him like water around a stone, giving him all the space his grief demanded. He stopped 10 paces from Thomas, close enough that the white man could see the pain etched in every line of his weathered features. "Her name was Ayanna," the old man said, and his voice carried the weight of a father's love turned to ash. "She was the morning star that guided our people through the darkest nights. You took her from us." Thomas felt the world tilt beneath his feet. Somewhere in the deepest corners of his mind, something stirred, a fragment of memory, quick as lightning and twice as bright. A woman's face, dark eyes wide with terror, hands bound with rope. The image flashed and faded before he could grasp it fully. Sheriff Morrison pushed through the crowd, his hand resting on the butt of his Colt. "Now see here," he said, his voice carrying the authority of his badge. "You can't just come into our town making accusations." The Apache man never looked away from Thomas. "I can speak truth anywhere the sun shines, Sheriff. This man knows what he has done." "I don't know what you're talking about," Thomas said, but the words felt like lies even as they left his lips. His heart hammered against his ribs like a caged bird fighting to escape. The old man's eyes narrowed, and Thomas saw something there that chilled him to the bone. Not just grief, but certainty. This wasn't guesswork or desperate hope. This man had traveled far and suffered much to find him, and he had found exactly who he was looking for. 2 winters passed, the Apache elder said, his voice growing softer but somehow more terrible. "You wore the blue coat of the soldiers. You rode with men who spoke of justice but brought only sorrow." The crowd pressed closer, drawn by the drama unfolding in their dusty street. Thomas felt their eyes on him like brands against his skin. These people had accepted him, trusted him, given him a place to start over. Now that carefully built new life felt as fragile as morning frost. "My daughter was no captive," the old man continued. "She chose her path, chose her place among your people. But you saw only what your fear allowed you to see. Mrs. Henderson from the boarding house gasped. Thomas, you never said you were a soldier. Thomas swallowed hard, tasting copper and dust. That was a long time ago. I'm not that man anymore. The Apache elder's laugh held no humor, only the bitter sound of wind through dead leaves. A man does not shed his sins like a snake sheds skin. They follow him like shadows, and shadows always find the light. Thomas felt something breaking inside his chest, some carefully constructed wall that had held back a flood of memories he'd spent 2 years trying to forget. The old man's words were keys, turning in locks he'd thought he'd thrown away forever. I need to, Thomas started, then stopped. What could he say? What words could possibly bridge the chasm of pain that stood between them? The Apache elder studied him for a long moment, and Thomas saw something shift in those dark eyes. Not forgiveness, but perhaps a recognition of Thomas's struggle with whatever truth lay buried in his past. My name is Nailnish, the old man said finally. I am the father of Iana, the woman you stole from her chosen life and delivered to her death. The words settled over the crowd like dust after a stampede, heavy and choking. Thomas felt his legs give way, and he sat down hard on the steps of Murphy's store, his head spinning with fragments of memory that cut like broken glass. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled the hour, but Thomas barely heard it. All he could hear was the echo of 5 words that would haunt him until his dying day. You took my daughter. And deep in his heart, beneath all the fear and confusion, a terrible certainty was beginning to take root. The old man was right. As the desert wind picked up the scattered coins at Thomas's feet and sent them rolling into the dust, he realized that some debts couldn't be measured in silver or gold. The weight of Nailnish's grief settled over him like a heavy coat, and he knew that whatever peace he'd found in this small town had just crumbled to dust. The hardest part wasn't the accusation itself. It was the growing certainty that somewhere in his buried memories lay a truth he wasn't sure he was strong enough to face. The whiskey burned his throat, but it couldn't wash away the Apache woman's face that haunted every glass. And when the memories finally surfaced, Thomas discovered he wasn't the hero he'd convinced himself he was. The Dusty Rose Saloon had never felt so small. Thomas sat hunched over his 3rd whiskey, watching amber liquid catch the afternoon light that filtered through grimy windows. The bar felt like a cave, offering the only shelter he could find from the eyes that followed him through town since morning. Behind him, conversations died when he passed, and whispers bloomed like desert flowers after rain. The townspeople spoke in hushed tones about the Apache elder who had set up camp outside the saloon like a patient vulture, sitting cross-legged in the shade of the old oak tree, waiting. You gonna drink yourself to death, or are you gonna face whatever's eating at you? Frank Murphy, the bartender, wiped down glasses with mechanical precision, but his eyes held the calculating look of a man measuring another man's worth. Thomas lifted his glass, studying the way the whiskey trembled in his unsteady hand. Sometimes a man drinks to forget. Sometimes he drinks to remember. And which are you doing? Thomas didn't answer. He couldn't, because the truth was both and neither. Every sip burned away the edges of his carefully constructed new life. But underneath, like bones in shallow graves, older memories were surfacing. He closed his eyes, and there she was again, the Apache woman from his fragmented recollections. Dark hair braided with blue beads that caught sunlight like captured sky. Eyes that held intelligence and something else, something that had made him uncomfortable even then. Not fear, exactly, but a kind of resigned sadness that suggested she understood things he couldn't grasp. The saloon door creaked open, and Thomas felt the change in the air without looking up. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Someone's chair scraped against the wooden floor as they shifted nervously. He's been sitting out there for 4 hours, Sarah Mitchell's voice carried from the doorway. She ran the dress shop across the street and never missed a piece of gossip worth spreading. Just sitting like a stone, watching this place. What's he want with Thomas? This from Bill Crawford, who owned the livery stable. Claims Thomas took his daughter, Frank said, polishing the same glass for the 4th time. Thomas was a soldier, apparently. Never mentioned that before. Thomas felt their eyes on him like heat from a branding iron. These people had welcomed him, given him work, let him become part of their community. Now, they looked at him like a stranger wearing a familiar face. "I never lied to anyone," Thomas said quietly, not lifting his head from his drink. "Just never told the whole truth either," Frank observed. The whiskey was loosening things in Thomas's mind that had been locked away tight. Images came in flashes. The weight of a cavalry saber at his hip, the taste of trail dust, the sound of horses' hooves on hard ground. And always, threading through it all, the memory of that woman's face. He remembered now, or began to. It was winter 2 years past. Their unit had been tracking raiders who'd been hitting supply wagons between Fort Apache and Tucson. They'd followed the trail to a small homestead tucked into a valley where cottonwoods grew thick along a creek. The scene that met them there had seemed clear enough at the time. A burned cabin, scattered belongings, and in the middle of it all, an Apache woman tending to a sick white child. The assumption had been easy to make. Raiders had attacked, killed the settlers, taken captives. But Thomas remembered something else now, something that had nagged at him even then. The woman hadn't run when they approached. She'd stood up slowly, her hands empty, and spoken to them in clear English. "Please," she had said, "the boy is sick. I'm caring for him." Thomas's commanding officer, Lieutenant Haze, had laughed. "Sure you are, squaw. Just like you were caring for his parents when you slit their throats." "No," the woman had said, and her voice had been steady despite the fear in her eyes. "This is my home. My husband died of fever 3 months ago. The boy is my son." But Hayes hadn't listened. None of them had. They saw what they expected to see, an Indian among white belongings, and that was story enough. Thomas lifted his glass with a hand that shook worse than before. He remembered now how they'd bound her hands despite her protests. How she called the boy by name, Johnny, and how the child had cried when they pulled her away from him. How she'd looked back over her shoulder as they rode away, not with hatred, but with heartbreak. "Jesus," Thomas whispered, and the glass slipped from his fingers, shattering against the floor. The saloon went quiet except for the slow tick of the clock above the bar and the distant sound of wind rattling the windows. Frank came around the bar with a broom, sweeping up glass with careful strokes. "You remember something, don't you?" Frank said quietly. Thomas nodded, unable to speak. The memories were flooding back now like water through a broken dam. Her name had been Ayanna, Morningstar. She'd told them that, pleading with them to understand. She'd been married to a white trader named Samuel Morrison who'd died of fever, leaving her to care for his nephew whose parents had been killed in an Apache raid years earlier. She hadn't been a captive. She'd been a mother, and Thomas had been the one to bind her hands. He'd been the one who'd lifted her onto his horse when she tried to run back to the sick boy. He'd been the one who'd delivered her to the reservation 300 miles away, where she'd been processed like livestock and assigned a number instead of a name. Through the window, Thomas could see Nailnish sitting beneath the oak tree. The old man's head was tilted back, eyes closed, lips moving in what might have been prayer or might have been a conversation with ghosts. His weathered hands rested on his knees, and Thomas could see now how they trembled, not with age, but with the effort of containing a grief too large for any one man to carry. "She died there, didn't she?" Thomas said to the empty air. "On the reservation." Frank stopped sweeping. "What?" "His daughter. The woman I helped take. She died there." The admission hung in the air like gun smoke. Thomas felt something break inside his chest, some last defense against the truth he'd buried so deep he'd almost convinced himself it had never happened. Outside, Nailnish opened his eyes and looked directly at the saloon window. Their gazes met through the dirty glass, and Thomas saw in those dark eyes not hatred, but something worse, disappointment. The look of a man who had hoped, despite everything, that he might be wrong. But they both knew he wasn't wrong. Thomas pushed back from the bar, leaving coins scattered on the wet wood. His legs felt unsteady, but not from the whiskey. The weight of memory was heavier than any drink could make him. "Where you going?" Frank called after him. Thomas paused at the door, his hand on the handle. To face what I've done. As Thomas stepped out of the saloon's dim protection and into the harsh afternoon sun, he felt the full weight of Nailnish's grief settle over him like a physical presence. The old Apache man didn't move, didn't speak, but something passed between them in the dusty silence, an understanding that the time for denying and forgetting had come to an end. Now came the harder part, learning to live with the truth of what they'd both lost that winter day and what could never be restored. When the Apache father finally told him what really happened to his daughter, Thomas learned that some sins are so heavy they can break a man's soul, and that the woman he'd rescued had died not from sickness, but from a broken heart. The desert night wrapped around them like a burial shroud, stars scattered across the black sky like broken glass. Thomas sat across from Nailnish beside a small fire that cast dancing shadows on their faces. Two men bound together by tragedy and separated by an ocean of pain. They had been sitting in silence for nearly an hour, the quiet broken only by the crack and hiss of burning wood and the distant cry of a coyote somewhere in the darkness. Thomas had emerged from the saloon as the sun touched the western mountains, and Nailnish had simply nodded toward the desert beyond the town's edge. Now they were here, in this circle of firelight that felt like the last island in a sea of night, and Thomas finally understood that running was no longer possible. The time had come for truth, whole and unvarnished as polished bone. "Tell me about her," Thomas said quietly, his voice barely audible above the whisper of wind through sagebrush. "Tell me about Ayanna." Nailnish's weathered hands rested on his knees, fingers intertwined like twisted rope. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of mountains and the loneliness of winter winds. She was born during the season when wild roses bloom along the creek beds. Her mother died, bringing her into this world, and I raised her with only the spirits and the old women to guide me. The old man's eyes reflected the firelight like dark water. She was curious about everything. Why birds sang at dawn, why water always finds the lowest place, why some men choose war when they could choose peace. Thomas felt something twist in his chest. The woman in his memories had been faceless, nameless, easier to forget that way. But Nailnish was painting her in colors too vivid to ignore. When she was 16 summers, traders came to our winter camp. There was a young man among them, Samuel Morrison, with kind eyes and gentle hands. He spoke our language poorly, but Ayanna understood his heart. Nailnish picked up a small stone and rolled it between his palms. My daughter chose to walk between two worlds. She married this white man not from duty or fear, but from love. The fire popped, sending sparks spiraling up toward the stars. Thomas watched them rise and fade, thinking of choices and consequences of bridges built and burned. Samuel was good to her, Nailnish continued. He learned our ways as she learned his. When his brother and sister-in-law were killed in a raid, they took in the boy, Johnny. Ayanna loved that child as if he had come from her own body. She sang him Apache lullabies and taught him to weave grass into baskets. He called her Ma in English and Amma in Apache. Thomas closed his eyes, but he could still see the scene from that winter day. The woman kneeling beside the sick boy, her dark hands gentle on his fevered forehead. She had been protecting him, not harming him. Samuel caught the fever that winter, Nailnish said, and his voice grew softer, more distant. It took him slowly, like a wolf circling wounded prey. Ayanna nursed him day and night, but death was stronger than love. When he died, she stayed to care for Johnny. That homestead was her home. That boy was her son. She had chosen her place in the world. Until we came, Thomas whispered. Until you came, Nailnish agreed. Soldiers who saw only what their fear allowed them to see. An Apache woman among white belongings. The story wrote itself in your minds before you even listened to her words. Thomas felt the weight of shame settle on his shoulders like a lead blanket. She tried to tell us. She said it was her home, that the boy was her son. But Lieutenant Haze, he wouldn't listen. Said Indians were all liars and murderers. Nailnish nodded slowly. Fear makes men deaf to truth. and Ayanna paid the price for your fear. The old man reached into a leather pouch at his side and withdrew something small and dark. He held it out to Thomas, a piece of obsidian shaped like a star, polished smooth by countless fingers. She made this when she was 10 summers old, Nailnish said. Called it her morning star, her connection to the first light of each new day. She carried it always, until the day you took her away. Thomas took the stone star with trembling fingers. It was warm from Nailnish's touch, and somehow he could feel the weight of all the hands that had held it. First small child's fingers, then a young woman's, then those of a mother comforting a sick boy. What happened to her? Thomas asked, though part of him already knew the answer would break something inside him that could never be repaired. Nailnish stared into the fire for a long moment before speaking. The reservation was a place where hope goes to die. They gave her a number, 247, and told her to forget her Apache name. She was assigned to a barracks with 40 other women, most of them broken by loss and despair. She asked every day about Johnny, begged them to let her send word that she was alive, that she would return to him. Thomas felt his throat close tight. Did they let her? The agent said Johnny was better off without an Indian mother. Said the boy would be placed with a proper Christian family and taught to forget the savage woman who had corrupted him. Nailnish's voice cracked like breaking ice. Ayanna stopped eating then, not from choice. The grief simply made food taste like ash in her mouth. The fire had burned low, but neither man moved to add wood. The darkness pressed closer, as if the desert itself was listening to this tale of loss and sorrow. She lasted 6 months, Nailnish continued. The agent wrote that she died of consumption, but I know better. My daughter died of a broken heart, separated from the boy she loved, forbidden to return to the life she had chosen, trapped in a place that saw her only as a problem to be managed. Thomas felt something hot and salty run down his cheeks. He hadn't cried since he was a boy, but the weight of Nailnish's words had cracked open something deep inside him. I found her grave 3 days after they buried her, the old man said. A wooden marker with her number, nothing more. No name, no recognition of the life she had lived or the love she had given. I sat beside that unmarked earth and spoke her real name until the stars came out, telling the spirits who she had been. The obsidian star felt heavy in Thomas's palm, heavier than stone should be. It carried the weight of a life cut short, of love severed by fear and ignorance. And Johnny? Thomas asked, though his voice was barely a whisper. Nailnish looked up from the dying fire, and Thomas saw something flicker in those dark eyes. Not quite hope, but something related to it. The boy lives, the old man said simply. That is why I have traveled so far to find you. Not for revenge, though the spirits know I have dreamed of it. I have come because Ayanna's son deserves to know the truth about the woman who loved him and the grandfather who searches for him still. The fire collapsed into glowing embers, casting their faces in red light that flickered like heartbeats. In that moment, Thomas understood that his carefully constructed new life was not the end of his story, but merely the place where his real journey would begin. Where is he? Thomas asked. 3 days' ride north of here, living with Samuel's cousins on a small ranch. They call him John Morrison now, and he believes his Apache mother was a savage who stole him from his rightful family. Nailnish's voice carried the weight of winter wind. He is 7 years old, and he has no memory of the woman who sang him to sleep with lullabies in 2 languages. Thomas felt the obsidian star bite into his palm as his fist clenched tight around it. The weight of what he had done, what they had all done, settled over him like stones in a shallow grave. In the silence that followed, broken only by the whisper of wind through sage and the distant call of night birds, Thomas finally understood why some men carry guns and why others carry grief that cuts deeper than any blade. As the fire died to glowing coals between them, Thomas realized that knowing the truth was only the beginning of his burden. Somewhere in the darkness beyond this circle of dying light, a 7-year-old boy lived without knowing his real story. That an Apache woman had loved him enough to die of heartbreak when they were separated. The weight of Iana's obsidian star in Thomas's palm felt like a promise he wasn't sure he was strong enough to keep, but one he knew he had to try to honor. The white soldier and the Apache father rode together toward the boy who would change everything. But when 7-year-old Johnny looked into his grandfather's eye for the first time, even Thomas understood that some bridges can heal the deepest wounds. Dawn broke over the Morrison ranch like a prayer answered, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold that reminded Thomas of the first morning he'd awakened without the weight of lies pressing down on his chest. 3 days they'd ridden together, he and Nailnish, their horses moving through desert and grassland with the steady rhythm of men who had found their purpose. Thomas had sold everything he owned before leaving Millerville, his small house, his furniture, the tools he'd used to build his carefully constructed new life. The money rode heavy in his saddlebags now, along with something heavier still, the obsidian star that had never left his palm since Nailnish pressed it into his hand beside the dying fire. The ranch sat in a shallow valley where cottonwoods grew thick along a meandering creek. Smoke rose from the chimney of a modest adobe house, and Thomas could see cattle grazing in the distance, their forms dark against the morning grass. It looked peaceful, prosperous, the kind of place where a boy might grow up safe and loved, ignorant of the larger sorrows that shaped his world. There, Nailnish said quietly, pointing toward the house. My grandson lives behind those walls. Thomas felt his throat tighten. Somewhere in that peaceful scene was a 7-year-old boy who had no idea that his Apache mother had died of heartbreak, or that his grandfather had searched for him across hundreds of miles of desert and mountain. They rode slowly down the slope toward the house, their horses' hooves muffled by the soft earth. As they drew closer, Thomas could make out details. A vegetable garden tended with care, chickens scratching in the yard, a rope swing hanging from the broad limb of an old oak tree. A woman emerged from the house as they approached, wiping her hands on her apron. She was perhaps 40, with graying brown hair and the kind of weathered face that spoke of hard work and honest living. When she saw them, her expression shifted from curiosity to caution. "Morning, ma'am," Thomas said, touching the brim of his hat as they reined in their horses. "I'm Thomas Whitmore, and this is Nailnish. We're looking for the Morrison family." The woman's eyes flicked between them, lingering on Nailnish's Apache features with the kind of wariness that came naturally to frontier folk. "I'm Mary Morrison. What's your business here?" Before Thomas could answer, a boy emerged from behind the house, carrying a bucket of water that seemed almost too heavy for his small frame. Thomas felt his breath catch in his throat. The child had his white father's sandy hair and fair skin, but his eyes, those dark, intelligent eyes, belonged unmistakably to his Apache mother. The boy set down the bucket and looked at the strangers with frank curiosity, showing no fear despite his aunt's obvious tension. When his gaze fell on Nailnish, something flickered across his young features. Not recognition exactly, but a kind of stirring, like a sleeper beginning to wake. "This is about Johnny, isn't it?" Mary Morrison said, her voice tight with protective concern. "About his past." Thomas dismounted slowly, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. "Yes, ma'am. We've come to tell you, and him, the truth about his mother. His mother was a savage who stole him from his rightful family," Mary said quickly, but her words carried the hollow ring of something repeated too often to be believed. "Johnny knows that. We've told him, you've told him lies." Nailnish spoke for the first time, his voice gentle but carrying the weight of absolute authority. Kind lies, perhaps, meant to protect him from pain, but lies nonetheless. The boy, Johnny, stepped closer to his aunt, but his eyes never left Nailnish's face. "Who are you?" he asked, his child's voice clear in the morning air. Nailnish swung down from his horse with the careful grace of an old man who had spent his life in the saddle. He approached slowly, stopping just outside the boy's reach, and knelt so they were at eye level. "I am your grandfather," he said simply. "Your mother's father." Mary Morrison gasped, but Johnny just tilted his head, studying the old Apache man with the intense focus that children brought to important mysteries. "My mother was bad," Johnny said, but there was a question in his voice, as if he'd never quite believed the story he'd been told. She stole me from my real family. No, little morning star, Nailnish said, and his voice cracked with emotion. Your mother loved you more than her own life. She died of heartbreak when soldiers took her away from you. Thomas stepped forward, his own voice rough with unshed tears. I was one of those soldiers, Johnny. We made a terrible mistake. We thought we were rescuing you, but we were destroying a family. The boy looked between them, his young mind working to process information that challenged everything he'd been taught. She loved me? Nailnish reached into his shirt and withdrew something small and dark. Another piece of obsidian, this one carved into the shape of a tiny horse. She made this for you when you were very small. You used to sleep with it clutched in your fist, and she would sing you songs in Apache about brave horses that carried their riders safely home. Johnny's eyes went wide. Somewhere in the depths of memory, beyond the reach of conscious thought, something stirred. His small hand reached out tentatively, and when his fingers touched the obsidian horse, his face transformed. I remember, he whispered. I remember the singing. Mary Morrison's hand flew to her mouth. Johnny, you were barely 4 when she was taken away. You can't possibly remember. But Johnny was staring at Nailnish with growing recognition, and Thomas saw in that moment the power of blood calling to blood across the years of separation and lies. The boy stepped closer to his grandfather, and when Nailnish opened his arms, he fell into them without hesitation. She called you her little morning star, Nailnish whispered into the boy's hair. Ayana, that was her name. It means the same thing in Apache. Thomas felt tears running freely down his cheeks now, but for the first time in years, they were not entirely tears of sorrow. Watching grandfather and grandson hold each other, he began to understand something that had eluded him in all his years of running from the past. Redemption was not about erasing what had been done, but about nurturing what could still grow from the ashes. Mary Morrison stood frozen, her world shifting around her like sand in a windstorm. You can't take him. He's ours now. We've raised him, loved him. No one is taking anyone, Thomas said gently. We're not here to destroy this family, ma'am. We're here to complete it. Nailnish looked up from his grandson's embrace. This boy has been blessed with love from 2 worlds. His Apache mother sang him to sleep, and his white family has given him safety and care. Both are part of who he is. Can you teach me the songs? Johnny asked, his voice muffled against his grandfather's shoulder. The one she used to sing? Every one, Nailnish promised. And I will tell you stories about her. How brave she was, how much she loved you, how she chose to build bridges between our peoples because she believed love was stronger than fear. Thomas reached into his saddlebags and withdrew a leather pouch heavy with coins. This is for Johnny's care and education, he said, offering it to Mary Morrison, and for whatever he might need to learn about both sides of his heritage. She took the pouch with trembling hands, her eyes still wide with shock and confusion. I don't understand. Why would you, after all these years? Because some debts can only be paid forward, Thomas said. Because a good woman died believing she'd been forgotten, and her son deserves to know the truth about the love that shaped his first years. The morning sun climbed higher, painting the little valley in shades of gold and green. Johnny sat cross-legged beside his grandfather while Nailnish began to teach him words in Apache, simple things like sky and earth and family. Mary Morrison watched from the porch, her initial fear gradually giving way to wonder as she saw how the boy seemed to blossom under his grandfather's attention. Will you stay? Johnny asked when the first lesson was finished. Nailnish glanced at Thomas, and something passed between the 2 men who had traveled so far together to reach this moment. I will stay near enough to teach you what you wish to learn, the old man promised. And Thomas has offered to help me buy land nearby, so you can know your grandfather without losing the family who has raised you with such love. Thomas nodded. It would take most of the money from selling his old life, but some investments paid dividends that couldn't be measured in silver or gold. Every boy should know where he comes from, he said. All of where he comes from. As the day wore on, Thomas watched Nailnish teach his grandson to weave grass into small baskets, the old man's weathered hands guiding small fingers with infinite patience. He saw Mary Morrison gradually warm to the idea that her nephew's heritage could be a gift rather than a burden. Most importantly, he saw Johnny's face light up with each new piece of his mother's story, as if someone was finally explaining a puzzle he'd been trying to solve his entire young life. When evening came, painting the sky in shades of purple and rose, Thomas knew his own journey was far from over. There would be other conversations, other truths to uncover, other bridges to build between worlds that had been taught to fear each other. But for the first time in years, the weight he carried felt like something other than pure burden. As he prepared to ride back toward town, Johnny ran to him and pressed something into his hand, a small grass figure woven in the style his grandfather had just taught him. "It's a horse," the boy said solemnly, "to carry you safely home." Thomas looked down at the simple gift, feeling the weight of love and forgiveness it represented. "Thank you, Johnny. This means more than you know." The boy smiled, and in that moment, Thomas saw not just Iana's eyes looking back at him, but something of her spirit too, the part of her that had chosen to build bridges instead of walls, to love instead of hate, to believe in redemption even in the face of unforgivable loss. As Thomas rode away into the gathering dusk, the desert wind carried the sound of Nailnish's voice teaching his grandson an Apache lullaby. The song was wordless to Thomas's ears, but its meaning was clear as starlight. Some wounds could heal, some losses could find new purpose, and some love was strong enough to survive even death and separation. The obsidian star in his pocket caught the last rays of sunlight, no longer just a reminder of what had been taken, but a promise of what could still be restored. Behind him, 3 generations of a broken family were learning to be whole again, and ahead of him lay the possibility of a future built not on forgetting the past, but on honoring it enough to ensure it never repeated. In the end, Thomas realized redemption had never been about erasing his sins. It had been about planting seeds of love in the ground where those sins had left their scars, and tending them with enough care that something beautiful could grow. The desert wind whispered around him as he rode, carrying stories of healing across the vast landscape. And for the first time in years, Thomas Whitmore was not running from his past, but riding toward a future where broken things could be made whole again.